You're going to have to do like a pinky promise or a cross your heart here, because I'm going to be sharing with you the places that I buy vintage fabric. A really lovely viewer asked me if I could possibly do a video on how I go about finding, sourcing, buying my vintage fabrics, and I thought, genius, what a fantastic idea. So here is my top tips video on how I buy and source my vintage fabrics. If you're in the vintage community and you love sewing, vintage fabrics are the creme de la creme, the holy grail of fabrics. And obviously they can be a little bit hard to come by. So today I'm going to be sharing my top tips on how I go about sourcing, buying vintage fabrics. And I'm also going to be sharing my cheating secrets, how you can find and basically use modern fabrics instead of vintage fabrics. My first tip, and the thing that I think is actually the most important, is to understand what it is that you are looking for. If you know as much as you can know about vintage fabric, it doesn't matter where you are or where you go, you will zoom in like a hawk searching for its prey on that vintage beauty that's just sitting there underneath and amongst loads of other stuff. Educating yourself and really getting to grips with what vintage fabric is, what the patterns are, the colours, the textures, all of these things that make vintage fabric so different to fabric that we can buy now. If you understand that, then you really are onto a winner. So I am going to share my favourite resources that can help you do that. Now the first thing is, go to as many vintage shops as you can just to look, because one, it's wonderful, and two, actually getting your hands onto clothes made from vintage fabrics of the time, the era that you are particularly interested in, will really go a long way to making you understand how you can identify fabrics when you find them out in the wild looking all pretty and waiting for you. Once you get acquainted with the types of cloth that I use, the texture, the fibre content, and also the colours, because remember, back in the day industrial processes were different, dyeing and chemicals and all of the things that go into actually making fabrics are going to be completely different, and that is why we just can't really find or replicate a lot of these fabrics now. One of my favourite books is this 40s Fabric. This book focuses particularly on cotton, but it goes through all sorts of patterns from florals and geometrics, plaid, novelty and so on, and the pictures in here are fantastic, to the point where you will be able to find and pick out vintage fabrics from 100 feet away just from the brilliance of all of this. And I would just advise leafing through it regularly to sort of imprint the designs into your brain, so that when you go off hunting for vintage fabric treasure, you will be able to remember these fabrics, or take the book with you, or maybe photograph some of your favourites and keep them on your phone, so that when you're out and about in the wild you can remind yourself of the types of things that you are looking for. I don't know if there's a 30s version of this book, but that's pretty good. These two books I really love. They are the Style Me Vintage books, one by Naomi Thompson and the other by Liz Tregenza. One's clothes and the other is Style Me Vintage 1940s. I really like these little books for all the wonderful photos of fabrics actually that really help you identify. This one goes through decades from, I think, the 20s, and although it's not incredibly in-depth, there's enough visual source material to really get you acquainted with the type of fabrics and the colours and so on that you will find. The 1940s one is a particular favourite of mine, and there's loads of really good information about fabrics and the prints and the colours, because colour is really important when it comes to vintage fabric. And these are really useful as well when you are aiming to cheat your way through. This book is a great one, Textile Design 200 Years of Patterns. It kind of tapers off in the kind of 50s and 60s, but there's loads of really good good imagery in here, and well worth having on your bookshelf. You also could have a look at online archives. Museums like the V&A will have lots of source material there, and often have exhibitions about this stuff. So the more you educate yourself, the more you will be able to refine and identify out in the wild those elusive vintage fabrics that you need to be able to make wonderful reproduction vintage inspired garments. My second tip is really a little bit of damage limitation, a few little things to consider when you're buying either online or you have found some amazing vintage fabric in your local trouser shop. When buying online, do make sure that you double check the amounts of fabrics. It can be quite confusing because a lot of vintage fabric sellers online are selling basically fat quarters, so you want to make sure that you are able to buy enough fabric to make the thing it is that you want to make. Some vintage dealers do sell in like lengths, so they might have a 3-meter length and that is however much, but just be sure that you have double checked, because if it's not clear, then get in touch with the dealer. I'm sure they're quite happy to answer your questions, and that way you can avert any disappointment when you think that you've bought a really beautiful length of cloth to make yourself a wonderful 1930s tea dress, and actually you've bought yourself enough to make a very lovely 1930s handkerchief. Also bear in mind width, because vintage fabrics are a much narrower width. Case in point, this fabric here is only this wide. So there is a lot of it. I have oodles and oodles of this, but this will take some quite clever jiggery pokery pattern placing. Got to really think about what it is that I want to make. I know that I want to make some kind of blouse, but which blouse I'm not entirely sure at the moment. But definitely check that width, because if it's really narrow, it doesn't matter if you've got 10 meters of it. You're going to have to really think about the thing that you're going to make, so do be very careful. Less easy to see online, but much easier in real life, is do check for damage, because if you are somebody who likes pristine, perfect fabric, then trying to find that in vintage fabric might be a little bit complicated. Sometimes there is sun damage, sometimes there's water damage or staining because it may have been in storage somewhere a little bit. Ooh. Also, the other thing to really think about is moth, and bringing vintage fabrics into the house. Very easy to deal with those. Get yourself some Ziploc bags, and as soon as you get home, fold up the fabric. I tend to give it a shake outside before I even bring it into the house. Fold it up, pop it in the Ziploc bag, do it up, and then pop it in the fridge, and I leave it there for a good week. You can also wash your fabric. Be very careful because some dyes do tend to run. I generally wash my vintage fabrics in a warm, cold to warm water with a little bit of delicate laundry detergent in. I use E-Cover and it seems to do the trick. I'm also not terribly bothered about fabric that's a little bit damaged or stained or old. To me, that just adds to the story, and I'm happy to work around it or incorporate it, because my love for vintage fabric means that, warts and all, I will love that fabric even if it's aged. The next thing that I'm going to be sharing with you is a top secret, so you must not share this with anyone, because I'm going to be sharing with you the places that I buy vintage fabric. I'm often asked how I end up with so much vintage fabric. I'm always on the lookout for it. Wherever I go, I'm looking for vintage fabric. But also, I just put the word out. Because I live in quite a small community, people know me as a vintage seamstress. So quite often I will get messages, or somebody will say to me their friend is having a big sort out and they've got all these patterns or fabrics, would I like to have a look? And I always say yes, even if it maybe is sort of 80s stuff or whatever. You never know what gems you're going to find. The other places that I go, which will come as no surprise to you, are charity shops, car boot sales. We don't often have garage sales here in England, as far as I know, unless this is a secret that nobody's told me. And I do tend to get quite a few pieces of my fabric from studio sales. So I live in an area where there are lots of creative people, and because I've worked in industry for a gazillion years, I know lots of people who know people, and when they're having studio sales and clear outs, I take myself there quick sharp to see if there's any vintage loveliness to be had. On Instagram, these are the people that I particularly like who sell really, really good vintage fabric. Shop Make This Look are fantastic and have an amazing selection of vintage fabric from the 30s, 40s, 50s. Past Caring Vintage is another Instagram seller who has some really lovely vintage clothing, but on occasion some amazing fabrics, so definitely worth checking out their Instagram and their Etsy shop. Two Etsy sellers that I particularly like are Oh So Vintage by Sarah. She has a lovely selection of fabrics from across eras, and you may recognise some of these fabrics, especially this one right here, which also comes in another colourway, so that one might have to go in my basket. I also really like Donna Flowers Fabrics. It's more of a 60s, 70s sort of day glow, trippy, daisy type fabric, but if that's your cup of tea, then she's another really good one, and she always seems to be very well stocked with lots of very authentic 60s and 70s printed fabrics. Two places that I really like to go for vintage notions are Swagman's Daughter and also Accessories of Old, which is a new to me company. I've not ordered anything from them, but they have some incredible stuff on their website, so well worth a rummage there. And I'm not gonna lie, I got quite a few things in my basket. So you read everything you can about the time that you want to replicate. You go to all the car boot sales, you trawl Etsy and Instagram and eBay and all of these places to see if you can find some vintage loveliness, but alas, there is no vintage loveliness to be found. What do? In one very simple word, you cheat. You are now so versed in what is an authentic 1930s floral print cold rayon viscose that you are going to be able to find a substitute, so a modern fabric that either really looks vintage or is specifically reproduction or designed to look vintage. So my final tip, top tip, tip number 4, if anyone was counting, is how to dupe your vintage fabrics. And these are the places that I would recommend. A company based in Lewes, which isn't that far from me here in Hastings, is called Maltings Fabrics, and they specialise in reproducing vintage prints on either cotton or viscose. They have some amazing fabrics that they are selling, all basically digitally printed, so quite sustainably made. They work with film and TV productions replicating fabrics. So lots of those lovely fabrics that you will have seen in recent productions like The Dig or maybe Agatha Christie and so on will feature some of the fabrics that they have reproduced. Fabric Godmother is another Sussex based company, and they specialise in dead stock fabrics. They have a lot of ex-designer fabric. They do have an incredible range of crepe in various colours, which is incredibly good quality. Really, really fabulous. I cannot recommend it enough. And they've also been working with another company, the Pattern Print Archives, I think they're called, to reproduce some vintage fabrics. So they have lots of fabrics that would dupe as vintage looking fabrics, but also vintage prints that are newly, freshly printed. I've worked with some of their viscose twill and it was a dream. And last but not least, I have to give a very high recommendation for Missy Mop Fabrics, who is a friend of mine and located here in Hastings too. She has an incredible range of fabrics. She's got a very good eye and she does tend to look for things that are vintagey, spanning from way back up till, well, now, but she's very good at finding fabrics that would dupe for vintage fabrics, and I found some lovely viscoses and viscose crepes that I've used for both myself and clients in the past. I hope that you've enjoyed my top tips for finding your own vintage fabrics. If you have anything to add to this, then please do pop it in the comments below. It's always really helpful to share your advice, ideas, etc. And all links for everything that I've mentioned, as far as I possibly can, will be in the doodah bar, whatever it's called, below. Thank you so much for spending time with me in my little cottage by the sea, talking today about one of my favourite topics, which is, of course, fabric. And what could be more wonderful than vintage fabric? So I hope this has been helpful and useful for you. And if you haven't already subscribed, then I'd love it if you would, because it really helps to support my channel, and I love making sewing content for you lovelies, and it's just lovely to share this journey with you. I hope that wherever you are, you're keeping safe and well, and I'll see you soon for some more sewing goodness. Take care, my lovelies. Bye.